Good evening to everyone at the Institute and everyone also who's joining us online for the latest in our democracy lecture series. I'm Sam Miner, and this is Professor Martin Conway. It gives me really great pleasure to welcome Professor Conway here this evening at the Institute for Contemporary History. Professor Conway is a professor of contemporary history at Balliol College in Oxford. Professor Conway began teaching there in 1990, I believe it was. Yeah. He also got his PhD at Oxford, where he worked, I believe, with Richard Cobb, which is really quite a strong lineage to come from in French and Belgian history. Professor Conway published his first book in 1993, which was a reworking of his dissertation entitled Collaboration in Belgium, Léon Degrelle and the Rexist Movement, 1940 to 1944. That book examined militant Catholic, corporatist, and the collaborationist Rex Party in Belgium. Professor Conway's ties to the study of political Catholicism only deepened with another book that he published in 2008, was it? Another book that was published later in the 90s called Catholic Politics in Europe, 1918 to 1945. In 2012, Professor Conway published the book The Sorrows of Belgium, Liberation and Political Reconstruction, 1944 to 1947, in which he undertook a study of the reconstruction of the Belgian state, while also arguing that that very same state eschewed a radical reconstruction in favor of returning to many of the pre-war molds of politics. That book, I think, especially bridges to a book you recently published in 2020, which ties both your work on political Catholicism to democratic reconstruction in post-war Europe. And that is this book, so everyone can see. That is the book, Western Europe's Democratic Age, 1945 to 1948, in which, again, he examines many continuities of pre-war European democratic reconstruction in the post-war, as well as the breaking point of 1968 and a more participatory model that followed. I'm really looking forward to seeing how this most recent book ties in with what you're going to talk about this evening. I'll save all the many accolades that I'll try to just do a few of those that Professor Conway, we can talk about with Professor Conway. But among other things, he is a member of the Royal Academy of Belgium, the University of Heidelberg's Academic Council, and also a fellow of the Aberystwyth University, which is also his hometown. And we had a nice little discussion upstairs about coming from that small town and a place I really wanted to visit. Anyway, in 2022, Professor Conway was a visiting fellow in the Humanities Council at the Department of History in Princeton. Finally, very relevant to our own work at the EFZ and that of the Democracy Cluster and this Democracy Raya, Professor Conway, Celia Donert, and Kieran Patel are the editors of a new series published by Cambridge University Press entitled European Histories of the Present. In a recent article in Hypotheses, which I was reading, the editors challenged us historians to quote, liberate the history of the present by engaging more readily with the questions and problems of a post-1989 world. I imagine that tonight's speech will address head-on the issues of the history of the present, but I'll hand the floor over to Professor Conway to discuss political masculinity, and I very much look forward to the conversation after your talk. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sam, for that very generous introduction. And it's a particular pleasure, I think, for me to be in Munich today and to be in this building, a building that I feel I have known virtually from a distance for decades, really, you know, as it's because of its preeminence in a particular way of doing contemporary history, which, to link with what you just said about the history of the present, is something I've been thinking about a great deal in terms of when does a rather classic definition of contemporary history end and when does a history of the present begin, or is there no difference between them? Is it just about a contemporary history that gets longer? I think these are conceptual questions that we historians of Europe, at least, have not really engaged with sufficiently. And that was the reason why Kieran, Celia, and I thought that we needed to create a series of volumes on the history of the present. So if there's anybody in the room who wants to pitch to us a book for Cambridge University Press on the history of the present in Europe, then you're very welcome to approach me. When I got off the tram this afternoon, having found my way successfully to the right corner of Munich, of course, the billboard that greeted me when I got off the tram was announcing a public meeting about the Demokratie von morgen. This idea that democracy is stuck somewhere between the past and the future in Europe is, I think, one that I feel very strongly. It's the meta-narrative of our present in Europe, a lament for a democracy that somehow we think we have lost, that's sort of rather stuck back in a nostalgic vision of the post-1945 or post-1949 decades in Western Europe, and a democracy of the future that we aren't managing to arrive in. And what's wrong is the democracy of the present. So the language of a crisis of democracy is very present in all European countries at present, and one understands very much why when one sees some of the political upheavals, and I suppose in many ways the speed of change, political change in Europe over the last 10 years, and anybody from Britain is particularly aware of that. And this sense of living in a rather particular moment of democracy has been evident in the way in which historians over the last decade have embraced the subject of democracy in Europe in the 20th century in really a very fruitful way. This is a good and necessary investigation of where democracy comes from, its very different historical experiences. And for more than a decade now, we've been having a series of books, very good books on institutions, on the forces, political and social, that shape democracy, and on the broader cultures of democracy, almost a democracy that exists outside of politics in terms of a broader culture of democracy. This is all good because it also reflects the way in which, as historians, I think we wanted to get beyond a history of political extremes in Europe that I suppose for English-speaking historians is associated above all with Eric Hobsbawm's book, Age of Extremes, with its emphasis on how the dynamism of Europe in the 20th century was to be found at the extremes of the political spectrum. It's a good thesis, but the problem is that it led to a preoccupation with those extremes at the expense of the broader political cultures of Europe, and particularly a lot of the work on the Weimar years, on the rise of Nazism, as we used to call it a very long time ago, was always preoccupied with the internal dynamics of Nazism and of the extreme right, rather than the broader democratic culture of the Weimar Republic within which it operated. So this turn towards democracy is, I think, something that we should welcome, and it has been very good. It has produced a series, I suppose, of dominant conclusions. One is that democracy can't be thought of to be a single process. There's clearly a division of democracy into different periods, even across the 20th century. It's not, as some perhaps a little while ago thought, some sort of single arc from some moment in the French Revolution or in 1848 towards the present day. Instead, it's something that needs to be chopped up in a way into different periods of the 20th century. And I'm going to talk about that this evening a great deal. You know, it's a discontinuous history of democracy, which may be slightly less heroic, but I think is much more properly historical. Because what we also derive as a conclusion from this recent work is the extent to which each society makes its own democracy, each era makes its own democracy. And what's perhaps most interesting about democracy as a political form is the degree to which it reflects the divisions, the inequalities, the forms of community, to put it more positively, that exist within European societies at different moments across the 20th century. So to put the democracy that came into existence after 1989 or 1990 in Central and Eastern Europe in the same category as the democracy that came into existence in Europe after the First World War seems to me to be profoundly mistaken. And in one of my less successful attempts at writing about this, I tried to write a history of democracy in the 20th century backwards, in terms of starting from 1989 and then going to the 1940s and then to the 1920s, just to try to disrupt that teleological narrative, which I still think plays in some people's heads, about the gradual expansion and development of democracy in Europe across the 20th century. We have to see it instead as a product of particular moments in the history of the 20th century. And that also implies that we need to come towards the present day. And I think one of the other good features of much of the democracy work in recent years is the extent to which it has reoriented 20th century historians towards the second half of the 20th century, towards a democratic age, to take the title of that book, but more generally towards an interest and a curiosity in what was making democracy such a hegemonic form of political organization in Western Europe, a very particular bit of Europe, Western Europe, in the decades after 1945. So that reorientation towards the second half of the 20th century also then raises questions that I think contemporary historians are still struggling with in terms of what then happened at the end of the 20th century and how we get beyond the conflicts at the end of the century into an era of neoliberalism, and then, of course, into this very volatile politics of what we call populism in the first decades of the 21st century. And joining up those different moments of democracy is, I think, a task that still confronts us as historians, but it feels like a good task. It feels like the right way of engaging in a properly historical study of democracy. So the history of democracy is always unfinished by definition. If each democracy exists within a particular era, then there is no terminus to the history of democracy. It is never complete. And for people to declare, as they perhaps began to do around the 1970s, that they had created a democratic politics and society in Europe is merely to condemn themselves to then be looking very out of date 10 or 20 years later. The history of democracy has this necessarily unfinished character, and I think the Federal Republic of Germany from 1949 to reunification is a very good example of a particular era of democracy, of which we now look back on as being that of a past era and not a democracy that we can, however nostalgic we might feel, somehow rescue and recreate to create the democracy of today. Democracy is a permeable membrane. It's a democracy it's a form of political regime which is very responsive to changes in society. And it therefore reflects very well, I think, the inequalities that exist in 20th century European societies. There is a class history of democracy. There is a sense that different democracies gave prominence to different social groups, particularly after 1945, the prominence of a certain middle class in Europe, the prominence also of the protection of a certain level of rural property owner. These are very interesting inequalities in democracy after 1945 that we can explain. And they contrast with other periods of democracy when other social groups, such as the working class, had a much more central role in democracy. So class is an inequality that is always present, and that perhaps after 1945 is particularly associated with an expanding and self-confident middle class. Age is another inequality that is reflected within democracy. I think something that's very interesting about the democracies that emerged after 1945 is that they were very much products of experience, of people who had lived through things. How could they not? But also that put the center of gravity of democracy after 1945 in the world of the middle-aged. It was a democracy that was built for a certain sort of human maturity, which perhaps also explains why it was so vulnerable to attack from the youth in the 1960s. So there was a sense that democracy after 1949 in Germany, but elsewhere in Europe, also found its center of gravity, its main audience, its main interest group in a particular cohort of people who were essentially as old as the century. Race is another inequality that dominates the history of democracy across 20th century Europe, with, I suppose, an easy speech to make about the imperfect integration of some immigrant racial groups into the structures of democracy, but also perhaps more subversively, one can think about immigrant groups who really do rather well out of structures of democracy. So there's a real history of racial inequality that you can read through democracy. And then there's gender, which is what I want to talk about primarily this evening. The extent to which we need to do a history of gendered democracy. And I think that, although it seems a pretty obvious theme to approach the history of democracy through, it's one that I don't think we've done enough work on. There is a familiar theme, which is about, either you could call it the long march or the slow success or whatever you wish to say, about the integration of women as full social and political citizens in European democracies across the 20th century. And that is a very well explored field. But if you change the word from women to men, I think one feels much less confident in knowing what a history of political men in 20th century democracies would look like, because there's a tendency among all historians, myself included, not to problematize the category of men, not to think about men as an active force in the making of, in terms of my theme this evening, making of political democracy. So there seems to me to be a gap, and one I'm interested in exploring at the moment in my current research, about how you would actually write a combined history of democracy and of men as political citizens, not men in their entirety, men in their political actions in Europe in the 20th century. Because the durable gendered inequality of democracies in Europe in the 20th century is something that just simply needs to be underlined again and again. It turned out to be the most durable inequality within democracy in the 20th century. While other inequalities fade away, those of class or those of age or whatever, the inequality of the dominance of men in the public sphere, in the political sphere, in the democratic sphere in the 20th century is something that perhaps only wanes very slowly at the end of the 20th century and is certainly absolutely not complete today. This inequality has probably three different dimensions. It's about the quasi-monopoly of power by men, in the sense of the occupation of so many of the leading positions in all democratic political regimes by men. It's about space. It's about the extent to which in institutions such as parliaments and so on, the dominant role of men created very male political spaces with their own particular cultures and their own forms of behavior that imprinted a certain male mode on democracy across the 20th century. And finally, then, it's also about the broader mores of politics, the public meeting, the election campaign, the strong rhetoric, the languages, the rituals of democracy. These, when you look at them, are pretty much always strongly gendered across much of the 20th century. I'll allow for some exceptions, but there is, I think, a satisfactory generalization one could make about the way in which it's actually a very male form of politics throughout the 20th century. We sometimes don't notice it because we get carried away with those pioneer stories, don't we? The first female deputies in France in 1945, the first female minister, France 1936, the first, Britain knows this well, prime minister, female prime minister. We don't pause long enough to think how late those firsts were, and we don't pause long enough to query how many came after them in terms of the emergence of a more gender-neutral democratic space in 20th century Europe. We could say that this inequality of gender within the political sphere, within the democratic sphere, is no more than one would encounter in many other areas of essentially professional middle-class life. This is something that one might associate with law or medicine or academia. But I think there's something slightly different about the extent to which there is an interconnection going on here between men and democratic politics. This is not just about the broader inequalities of society being reflected in the political sphere. There's something much more strongly gendered about this male presence at the center of democracy. It's not some accident that just happened because so much society was structured in that. It's about, and this is my key thesis for this evening, about the interconnectedness, the interestingly volatile relationship between male identities and democratic structures in 20th century Europe. I could, by the way, expand what I'm saying to talk about other political regimes, communist regimes, Nazi regime, fascist regimes. I'm going to stick with democracy for the sake of making it manageable. But there's a real interconnectedness between these themes, a way in which men get to control or largely control political power, but also the reciprocal relationship, the extent to which men are then made by political power. This is not just a one-way train. This is a train that is going backwards and forwards between male identities and political structures. Think again of that permeable membrane metaphor that I used 5 or 10 minutes ago. So this is also, because we're historians, not something that stays the same. It's something that evolves across the short 20th century from, say, 1918 to 1989. It's something that breaks up into particular eras of male politics at different moments in the 20th century. And therefore, what I'm very keen about is the extent to which my time has stopped working. The extent to which we can see particular eras of male democracy in 20th century Europe. And let me just sketch out for you necessarily, rather briefly, at what I think are 4 or 5 eras of male democracy in 20th century Europe. The starting point, I think, is an uncontroversial one, which is about the expansion, the dominance, the breakthrough moment of a certain male mass politics in Europe after 1918-19. Some of you may wish to go back and say, well, it's actually the Bismarckian Reich that provides the initial prototype of that. But I'm particularly struck by the renewed volatility of male mass politics after the First World War, something that one sees across a whole series of essentially new political cultures in Europe, as well as some rather more historic ones. This is the era of the male crowd, isn't it? It's about the politics in the street, in town squares, in halls, in meetings, in buildings, official and unofficial. It's the volatility, the sheer exuberance often of politics that happened in Europe in the 1920s. Much of that politics might have called itself anti-democratic. To my mind, that doesn't really matter. What matters is that the people were participating in what was essentially a male democratic political space in which, yes, you could catch sight of women on the margins of that mass politics, but it was surely the male presence which defined the character of that first era of mass democratic male politics. It was about making democracy, because democracy had to be made after 1918 in most European states. But it was also, for my purposes, about acting democracy, about performing democracy, about creating a new democratic political culture that would somehow indicate the arrival of Europe at a moment of democracy in which, without even thinking about it, it is the men who dominate. So that was the first moment of male democracy in 20th century Europe, but it then merges after the impact of the Great Depression and various upheavals in diplomatic and political life in the 1930s into a second moment of male democracy from the early mid-1930s through to the end of the Second World War in its long definition, perhaps 1948 or 1949, which is dominated by fighting for democracy. Not for a single definition of democracy, because if it had been a single definition, there wouldn't have been any fighting. It's a fight between different versions, different variants of democracy, including forms of democracy that one might associate with the communist movement broadly defined, and indeed with different versions of authoritarian or fascist politics, which often use the language of democracy, even if we don't really see within it the reality of democracy. Perhaps this starts most obviously in the streets of Hamburg, of Berlin, of Vienna in the sort of 1932, 1933, 34 period. But then it's most visible, isn't it, in the politics of the Spanish Second Republic and the emergence of the Civil War in 1936, when men really are fighting for democracy and men are volunteering to go to Spain to fight for liberty, freedom, and democracy. So it's a democratic politics of mobilization in defense of democracy, but also to achieve democracy, to go beyond existing democracy, to create a true democracy. So striking how at different moments across the 20th century, the word true gets put in front of the word democracy. So this is a fighting for democracy that occurs to some extent on the political extremes, but it also occurs within democracy over ownership of the concept of democracy. It was a rhetorical reference point, but also a real cause for which, to put it most prosaically, many men were willing to give their lives. I'm emphasizing the male element of it, not to somehow imply that women weren't part of this conflict, but to emphasize that it was predominantly, overwhelmingly, men who were engaged in this particular fight for democracy. It was men who were in uniform, or men who at least carried an armband that somehow carried the symbol of some political cause. It was men who were engaged in all the gesture politics of that period, be it oaths or oaths of fealty to improvised leaders or local rituals of flags and of liberation of a village from German occupation. It's about the politics of songs and of male bonding and of probably too much alcohol, which very much dominated that sort of male politics of the 1940s. And of course, it was ultimately about marching and about fighting in war, but also out of what conventionally one would call war. It was about the fighting, the male mobilization within, most strikingly, resistance groups in large areas of Western, Southern, Eastern, Southeastern Europe in 1943, 44, 45. How can we think about this without thinking about the Greek resistance or thinking about the extent to which Italy in 44, 45, when the front of Allied liberation came so dramatically to a halt, thinking about the extent to which this is actually a politics of voluntary male mobilization for different causes, including flags and nations, but also for democracy. And that, of course, leads on across large areas of the rather ungoverned Europe of the 1944, 1945, 1946 era to a much less structured male politics of liberation Europe, the extent to which it was men who became the dominant presence in committees of liberation, in the creation of new lists of new parties, in the invention almost overnight of large numbers of newspapers, quite a number of which never quite found an audience, but which demonstrated the extent to which male politics was something that was infusing, I was inclined to say a generation, but I think more than a generation, a whole cohort of men from their late teens who had been touched very much by the events of the war years, such as deportation to Germany, right through into their 50s, right across that sort of 30-year cohort. You see a very militant male politics in this period, often noisily on the left, but also associated with new forms of nationalism and often associated with rather archaic forms of political action. The emergence of new old-fashioned ways of doing politics out of doors in town squares. And of course, because Allied photographers were there to capture the moment, those particular moments of male vengeance against women who were seen to have collaborated with Nazi occupiers during the Second World War, and those incidents of head shaving, which always stand out as a particular moment of male release at the end of the Second World War. Except, of course, the Second World War did not end tidily in some moment in May 1945, and this sort of activist fighting for democracy, as I'm calling it, politics, very much spills over into the immediate post-war years, into the years of Reconstruction, but also in Central Eastern Europe into the building of regimes that one should remember were called people's democracies. And that was a very key concept of the particular Stalinist definition of socialism that emerged in Central Eastern Europe across the late 1940s. These were supposed to be democracies, but they were very gendered democracies. We know about a communist language of female militants, but we cannot get away from the reality of the politics of that decade after the Second World War was of about a particular era of male labor, physical labor, male engagement, male uniformed organizations, male political structures, the extent to which a slightly older generation of communist militants who had rather fortuitously managed to survive the intervening years could then become the dominant male figure in a locality, in a trade union, in a town in the post-war years. This is a very particular model of male citizenship that, of course, proved very durable in Central Eastern Europe across the subsequent decades. Meanwhile, and this would be my third moment of democracy, of male democracy in the 20th century, you get the emergence after 1945 in this new space that comes to be called Western Europe of a very settled male democracy. And it was male. We do have some rather pious myths about the extent to which 1945 was a moment of the entry of women into European democracy through the enfranchisement of women, most obviously in certain European states, including finally Belgium in 1948. But it's also about the real reassertion of a particular version of normality and almost a version of citizenship and of decency and of civilization, which is very much associated with men. And it is that sort of recapturing of the democratic space by hierarchies of men defined by social class, by political organization, by their affiliation to churches or social organizations or trade unions. It's part of that quest for normality that builds up after the Second World War, which creates, again, a very gendered form of democracy that really dominates politics in Western Europe for about 30 years after the Second World War. So you get this very particular male democracy that's civilian for the first time. It's demobilized, it's out of uniform. Men are still doing their national service, but that's not how they enter the political sphere. That's something that happens in some barracks out of sight. What matters is about the emergence of this form of civilian male political organization after 1945. And they were mass organizations, if you think of trade unions or farmers' organizations or the great affiliated regime of Christian democracy across West Europe. And it's a new type of male democracy based on not shouting, on not being violent, and getting away from the excesses that might have been associated with male democratic engagement over previous decades. This is about emotional restraint. This is about control, self-control. It's about debate, not action. It's even about listening with some respect to those with whom you disagree. It's a product of reflection and of sobriety and of reading newspaper articles that are too long and too boring, really, to be consumable, but somehow demonstrate a new spirit of democratic seriousness after 1945. And the role of the man in all of this is to be a serious citizen, to be also engaged in a personal politics of representation, a personal politics of representation. He is there to represent his family in terms of the gendered constructs of the time, to represent his community, especially all those small towns and villages that actually found their place in the politics of democratic Europe after 1945. But it's also about membership. It's membership of social organizations. It's demonstrating your seriousness as a citizen by being a member. If you wish to turn your mind to it, becoming a member of a committee. Those hierarchies, subtle, that lead to the emergence of thousands of male-dominated committees as the basic unit of democratic political life in Europe, Western Europe after 1945. Now, quite a lot of that obviously has something of a middle-class character to it, but it's also about an expanding world of citizenship, which is spilling out from what you might in the late 19th century have seen as classically middle class, and about the extent to which socialist organizations, as has always been demonstrated very clearly with the SPD in Germany, became a political organization colonized by a certain male middle class in the last 4 decades, but also about the incorporation into that world of people who don't come from middle class backgrounds, but through the escalator of education and success in professional life, then they become part of this new form of male politics that I suppose is above all associated with the very successful template of Christian democracy in Western Europe in the post-war decades. Nothing lasts forever, and my penultimate periodization of male democracy in the 20th century is clearly going to be about the 1960s, except that everybody who teaches courses on the 1960s know the 1960s really happened in the 1970s. So it's essentially about the end of the 60s through into the 80s, in which, of course, the times were changing and new forms of conflict were emerging in West European societies, racial conflicts, immigration, rapid, disruptive, chaotic transformations in working class communities provoked by the closure of formerly core heavy industries, and the rediscovery of languages of revolution that in many ways had to be re-imported into Western Europe in the 1960s from the decolonizing global South. And with those new forms of disruption, you also get men who are changing. Men who are much more inclined to engage in action, much more inclined, as we know, on occasions to engage also in violence, on left and on right, be it Baader-Meinhof or the Bologna train bombing, the station bombing. You know, these are moments when political violence re-enters European political culture in the 1970s and often resulted in particular super male political cultures, misogynistic cultures, very militant cultures of the 1970s, ones that seem often to be, to our eyes, to be very dismissive of the presence of women within democratic politics, and a new repertoire of male action that we often look upon quite indulgently without recognizing quite how gendered it was. The politics of satire, the politics of mass demonstrations, anti-nuclear campaigns, be they about nuclear power or about nuclear weapons, direct action, politics for the environment. These are ways in which new forms of male militancy come into Europe through the language of what we call the new social movements. There's a very particular form, rehabilitation, I suppose I want to call it, of male democratic politics in the 1970s and 80s. I'm trying to avoid that inevitable word of backlash, but there is an extent of men reasserting a certain ownership of this much more volatile democratic space at this moment. It leads, of course, through the rather disruptive politics of the 1980s to a final moment of male mobilization in the 20th century, which is 1989. 30 years on from that moment, we're still, I think, only beginning to recognize the extent to which that was a moment of male politics too. We're very aware of the female presence in crowds and organizations in Central Eastern Europe in that year, but I think we need to recognize, and you've only got to look at the photography of the period to see it, the extent to which this was a mobilization of large crowds of men of different ages, but predominantly younger than one might expect, and who become the agents of a new definition of male politics, which sets the tone then of the normalization of post-communist politics in Central Eastern Europe in the 1990s. And the notion that this might have led to some sort of gender breakthrough in Central Eastern Europe, or indeed set an example for the male-dominated politics of Western Europe, is, I think, largely disappointed. This is a democratic politics that remained quite clearly in a particular male political key, and that reflects the sort of dominance of a male theatre in 1989, of actions, of demonstrations, of manifestos, of words, of speeches from balconies. This is somehow, as we all felt at the time, a bit of a throwback to 1848, and it's very much about the presence of men in the political sphere. So I've tried to walk through the politics of democracy in the 20th century, pointing out the extent to which there remains a thread through it of this form of male democratic politics, but also to break it up into different eras of male democratic politics, refusing to suggest that there's something fixed between a particular form of male power in society and a particular form of democracy. This is, I think, a much more interesting subject, one where both elements are changing. Men are changing, democracy is changing. But somehow the thing that never quite stops happening is the extent to which men remain at the center of democratic power. So 3 conclusions to finish very briefly. Democracy is a gendered form of politics. Do we need to say that? Well, sometimes I think we do, because I think that we somehow miss seeing the extent to which across the 20th century democracy was in many ways perhaps the most gendered form of politics. There's something about the construction of particular representative spheres in democracy that allowed men to have a particular dominance in the politics of democracy that you might not have seen to the same degree in some other political regimes. It wasn't, let me emphasize, to the exclusion of women. They're not my subject this evening, but the extent to which there is also a history of women and democracy is fairly evident to us. But look at the forms of male resistance to female presence in democratic politics, the practices of discrimination, the extent to which there is a determination to maintain and to uphold certain values of doing democracy that, at least to us later on in the 21st century, seem very particularly gendered. So that's the first conclusion, democracy as a gendered form of politics. And therefore, the larger conclusion that democracy, that it was a male democracy that one saw in Europe across the 20th century, a democracy made in a male shape with a male repertoire of actions. It's worth pausing on that. The extent to which the democracy of the 20th century was based around things that men do, by which I mean actions, decisive, courageous, demonstrations of male character through the sphere of democratic politics. Alongside actions, it's also about rhetoric. It's also about speech. It's about forceful speech. It's about fluent speech. Remember that microphones didn't really come in until later on in the 20th century. It was about shouting as loud as you possibly can. And the extent to which I think we're still coming to terms with a kind of auditory differentness to democratic politics in the first half of the 20th century only serves, I think, to underline my point that this was a politics that was necessarily dominated by male voices. And then it's also about that particularly male definition of representation, men representing others. Some of the others are other men. Some of the others are men of lower social status. Some of the others are men of different ethnic or racial groups. Some of them are women. And this ambition of men to act as spokespeople for women in democratic politics in the 20th century, with that particular language of a rather patronizing welfare politics that comes to the fore in Europe in the 20th century, is, I think, something that we still have to kind of grasp was in itself a very gendered form of democracy. So it's a very performative form of male democracy that's based around these issues of actions, representation, and rhetoric. My final conclusion, which is a more speculative one, is that, as I tried to say at the beginning, this is a reciprocal relationship. So I think we also have to think about the extent to which men were made by democracy. It wasn't just about the democracy that was made by men. It created men in a certain mold, and I've talked a little about that, haven't I, in terms of the emphasis on rhetoric and certain forms of performance in the public sphere. And we know, of course, that men are also being made by other forces, be it consumerism, mass culture, cinema, and inevitable point, the state. The state is very concerned to mold men in particular ways and to make men into reliable agents of state policy, be it at the modest level of them making sure that they are obedient to law, or in the more ambitious level of making them into fighters who will fight for the nation. But we shouldn't emphasize or too greatly, the malleability of male identity under the pressure of state action. And I find that some of the more superficial cultural history of men in the 20th century is always too preoccupied by the extent to which men are molded by these other forces. For me, the dominant form of political action that emerges through this history of male democracy is actually about resistance. Not with the dominant, not with a capital R, but the extent to which men often pushed back against state policy. They might support state policies if they could see the benefits for themselves or for their communities in those policies, but there's a social contract going on between men and government in the 20th century, which also helps to explain the very large moments of rebellion that occur on the part of men at various moments when they are pushed too far in the 1940s or the 1980s, perhaps, or by regimes that they no longer regard as legitimate. So there's that pushing back of men, which points up a whole broader theme that I won't go into now about the extent to which male identities might be made outside of the political sphere, in family, in community, and of course, in workplace. So it's that sort of extent to which this male identity is not a state-controlled politics. It does become a democratic politics. And the making of democratic men is, I think, a very interesting theme in 20th century Europe. Men who have internalized a sense of their rights as individuals, but as members perhaps of communities. Men who have interests that they wish to assert and wish to demonstrate, be though in an awful way their own racial identity, or be it in a way we find easier to digest, their extent to which they stand up for the rights of working people in capitalist workplaces. Through all of this, it's democratic men representing their community in those spheres such as family, neighborhood, and workplace, and defending their interests and convictions, sometimes quite physically against forms of exploitation that they perceive. So there is something here which is about the 20th century history of democratic men that I think demonstrates, to my mind, this particular reciprocal relationship between men and democracy that dominated the 20th century and that certainly remains with us today. Thank you very much.
I see now that there's both possibility to pose questions online, as well as, of course, anyone in the room, and we have quite a bit of time for that. So please, if you would like to start it. Yes. If you could wait for the microphone.
Thank you. And can you hear me? What's striking is the relationship of political violence and your narrative of men doing things, fighting for their associations, and then that sort of dying away and being threatened by all the forms of political violence and that sort of dying away. And the second point would be, okay, to be a bit pedantic, you could project this backwards into the 19th century as well. I mean, that's the birth of those structures and men doing things in the way that you described that, you know, at first in the confessional sort of struggles of the age, you know.
Yeah. Culture wars.
Yeah.
Culture wars, sorry. Culture wars.
Yeah. And then thirdly, the relationship between economic processes. I mean, this seems to be mirrored by the development of industrial capitalist democracy, you know, the working classes, and then the dying of these identities and workplaces shape these things. So I was just wondering, yeah, I guess those are my three thoughts. Yes.
Well, I've written down the last two, 19th century culture, 19th century prehistory, and the workplace. What was your first?
How far is this shaped by political violence? I mean, not just back from like a, you know, react. You know, that great collective experience of First World War, sort of the first, you know, the rejection of that.
Yeah, some years ago, I made a vow to manage to give talks about the 20th century that didn't mention the First World War, because I feel that it becomes a rather too easy starting point for the way in which politics are somehow is dominated by the legacies of that great war. But when I think about the more informal forms of political violence that developed in Europe in the years following the First World War. I think obviously of the Freikorps, but also the emergence of communism, not just as some accident that had happened in Russia, but as a kind of what proved to be a very hard-won but durable presence in European political life, then of course one thinks about the extent to which this was a new interconnectedness between acts of violence and the acting out of male politics in the 20s and 30s. This was a politics that was not just about sort of rather 19th century notions of anarchists with bombs trying to blow up monarchs. It was about a much more neighborhood and bloody and very unpleasant form of political violence in which quite a lot of men found a particular, I suppose they found a particular relish in all of that. And there is the rather difficult term brutalization comes to my mind in this respect. And of course, it is very explicitly present in the Spanish Civil War. So yes, there is that starting point, which I did not emphasize enough. And apparently I should also have written a volume 0 of this talk in which I talked about the 19th century. Yes, I can see that, about the emergence of particular cultures of male politics through the French Revolution and the replacement of women in crowds by enfranchised men and the invention of a particularly male-dominated political space somewhere between the 1840s and the 1890s in large areas of Europe, I think, and the extent to which then the men become the actors in the culture wars between, say, Catholics and liberals or socialists or whatever in the later 19th century. Yes, that's all very important and just somehow too large a thing to talk about this evening. And then workplaces, yes. I don't think historians are ever very good at talking about politics in the workplace because they probably don't do enough of it themselves. There's the hidden world of the factory is one that a current doctoral student of mine has been writing about. You know, the extent to which this sort of democratic politics is happening out of sight in, say, the large car plants of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, a very contested sphere, a sphere of many strikes, of many struggles about different union forms of representation, different levels of skill, and different immigrant groups by the end of that era, but one that we can't always see, and which is also quite difficult to research in terms of the gaps in the archival evidence. So yes, there is a classic history of the workplace and the way in which that creates male politics in the 20th century. And you're dead right to say, to insert the word capitalist into this, because that's clearly something that's very central to this. But I'm not sure that the state socialist workplaces of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s that led to the solidarity movement in Poland, for example, were that different from that sort of male politics. So perhaps it's a politics of the workplace which can also travel between different regimes. But I think those are three excellent points that I had failed to mention.
Martina Stäbler.
Well, thank you very much for this kind of broad overview of male democratic politics in 20th century Europe. So may I press you on perhaps 2 points? The first one relates to your characterization of what happened in the 1930s and 40s, when you were saying basically there's a fight for democracy going on in Europe. And if I understood you correctly, you were kind of talking about different versions of democracy being in contest with each other. And you integrated kind of communism and fascism in this big picture of fighting for democracy in Europe. I'm a bit skeptical about this, I have to say. I mean, even if National Socialists, for example, use every now and then, but not often, the concept of democracy for describing their own kind of ideas and ways of organizing participation, and that's what it basically is, then I think we should be wary to follow their way. So I would be interested to learn a bit more about your idea of democracy. what is the essential core of what democracy actually constitutes for you? Do we need a democratic state? Do we need a democratic parliamentarian system? Is it a political culture? What's the core of democracy? Because if we widen the concept so far to integrate National Socialism, Italian fascism, and also communism in this concept, then I'm wondering what we are losing actually. So that's the first question. And the second one relates to your idea of the man and of masculinity. So I was wondering, I mean, my impression was that there's kind of a red line thinking about that there's kind of an essentialist male character to be found. Perhaps I'm kind of pronouncing this and I understood you completely wrongly, consisting basically of kind of an attachment to violence, to crowd politics, to hierarchies, to leadership. That's not a very sympathetic idea of a man, you know, and of masculinity. So I mean, if we talk about identity shaping by democracy, would you say that it is kind of a character shaping, or is there a preordained, basically male character there that then shapes democracy?
Excellent questions to which I will give very approximate answers, but they're very much food for thought for my own work on this. I'll take the second one first. I hope I wasn't presenting to an essentialist vision of male character and identity across the 20th century, because in a different sort of talk, I could have emphasized the extent to which sort of generational cohorts of men across the 20th century seemed to me to act out their masculinity outside of the political sphere in very different ways. It seems to me that men are made in really rather different ways across the 20th century, not opposing ways, but there's a sort of slow evolution of male identities across the 20th century, which also reflect the very different social structures in which men find themselves in different areas of Europe in the 20th century. But you're right to put your finger on that, because my concern to present men as not just the malleable subjects of state action or of any other forces that are molding them does actually lead me toward, dangerously perhaps, towards actually wanting to say that there are forms of male identity going on here which are slightly autonomous of broader social forces, and that are really something a force with a relative autonomy in European history in the 20th century. Whether I would be able to convince you or others of that argument, I don't know. And it's one that has led me into reading books of social psychology about masculinity and so on, in which I find myself predictably rather skeptical about the extent to which various early influences in people's lives or the influence of mass culture or whatever somehow shapes male identity. I'm always trying to look for the things that don't get shaped by that. So yes, that's an ongoing question in my own mind that you've also raised in your question. Now, the point about 1930s and 40s as a fight for democracy is probably, to some extent, if I want to escape from the challenge you presented me with, I might say I just got carried away a little with the enthusiasm of my own argument at that point, and I was conscious of it, and I actually reined it in. I want to suggest that communists and fascists were just other Democrats, and that there was just a kind of mass, multiple democracies going on in European politics in that period. And there's clearly a lot about those other political traditions that I would certainly never describe as democratic. I think I was wandering towards saying that because I was very struck by the extent to which the boundaries between those different political movements and what we might call democratic political movements were much less clear at the time than they were in retrospect. And therefore there are clearly, you see this in the Spanish Civil War, forms of left politics going on in Spain in the 1930s, which are clearly not, they don't fit any model of democracy. And yet people thought they were engaged in democracy when they were doing it. And I think, to say it in one sentence and then leave it, I think there are forms of NSDAP activism in the pre-1933 era in Germany, in which those people felt that they were being Democrats, and they were striving for something that they might have called a German, a Völkisch form of democracy. I'll leave it there. What I am concerned to say is that there is a necessary messiness about politics in that period, where people didn't really feel very well informed about the political causes that they got themselves enrolled in, and that there is therefore a democratic style to politics that is conducted by forces that we would not regard as democratic. Do I have a definitional approach to this? Probably not. I'm probably more concerned to emphasize the extent to which the definition of democracy is always rough around the edges, and was also something that changed at different periods, which is why I structured my talk around different eras of male democracy, in which the meaning of the content of that democracy changes quite a lot, as we all know, the emergence of social agendas within democratic politics and so on. So I think I was struggling in that section to try to convey an inclusive definition of democracy that perhaps became too inclusive, while at the same time also trying to maintain a necessary definition of what is democratic and not democratic. And I probably didn't get it right.
I might take one question from the online, and then Bernhard Gatto. We had a question someone typed in saying this: focusing on democracy as a male affair, how do you avoid putting white wealthy men again in front and center of European history? Why not follow the threads of intersectional entanglements also in the enactment and / performing of democracy?
Yes, why not indeed? I'm certainly not trying to bring back some sort of male-only history. I think, in my naive way, I feel I'm doing the opposite by exposing this identity of male democracy to a more critical gaze, in which the male identity becomes more visible, and to demonstrate the extent to which so much democratic politics in the 20th century was not intersectional, was not actually even concerned to involve women, for example, in significant roles, and instead concerned to give women at best a subsidiary role within the rituals of democratic politics. The putting forward of female candidates selected by male figures to conduct democratic elections. This sort of absence of intersectionality is something that I think is very characteristic of this male democracy up until perhaps the last 3 decades of the 20th century, and the extent to which then you get the emergence of new forms of cross-gender, if that's the right term, intergendered democratic activism in mass movements of the 1980s and 90s. One thinks particularly the environmental movement as a space in which this sort of male ownership of democracy is eroded quite rapidly in some areas of Europe. And of course, in my concern to try to get to the end of a coherent argument, I wasn't allowing myself to bring those forms of complexity into what I was talking about. But it seems to me that they are absolutely there in terms of the way in which politics in the last decades of the 20th century becomes much more intersectional, interracial, much more about actually, as one sees in the French sans-papiers movement in the 1980s, about the emergence for the first time of a politics that seems almost to be colorblind within democratic Europe. These are very interesting and indeed very positive trends, but they are ones that come in very late in the day. And I suppose today I was concerned to emphasize the late in the day bit rather than the extent to which they then become visible in European politics.
Bernhard Gatto. Oh, up in front. Bernhard, no problem.
Thank you. Well, my first question is about the raptures, the democratic moments. If we think of democracy not so much in terms of politics, but in ways of day-to-day behavior, kind of ideas, values that that make people behave in and act in a certain way. For example, what about visibility in public spaces, or as you mentioned for yourself, in behavior in workplace? How would that change that picture? Because I think that following your gendered approach to the to European democracy, we could come to other ideas. What democratic moments changed the direction of democracy? This is the first, not very small question. This is my opportunity to put them forward. The second is about different kinds of masculinity. In my view, it is very clear that there is a kind of democratic respectability for men. But as we all know, there is not just one kind of being a man in a political structure. And what other forms of democratic masculinities could we think of, and how would they interact? And maybe that could be an approach to blur that rather clear-cut picture of, for example, following the late 1960s, we have a more violent approach of political action performed by men. If we think of different masculinities which interact one with the other.
Thank you. Very thoughtful, thought-provoking questions. I take a rather anthropological lesson out of your first point about these particular moments of the behavioral visibility of male democracy at these moments. And I suppose the chronological approach I adopted was one which did privilege certain moments, but I'm, on the whole, not always inclined to regard these moments as being particularly revealing of the broader trends of male politics, which I think often move more slowly than the moments of political change, for example. But I do think that when, in my own work, I go back to the 1940s and to the sort of formative moments of mass mobilization in those years, you think, well, actually, these are moments that make men for the remainder of their political engagement. It throws men into particular forms of political action. And therefore, I should probably be taking more seriously the extent to which those moments, particularly the sort of moments of quasi-anarchy in Europe in the 1940s, as being ones which actually defined new forms of male democratic action. It's not so much politics, is it? It's male action in those moments. Second question, different kinds of masculinity, plural masculinities. Yes, of course. Now, why wasn't I talking about that enough? Partly because I was trying to emphasize this dominance of a particular male presence in politics. And that male presence seemed to me to be a presence that men made themselves without having to go through the intermediary chamber of the making first of their masculinity. But it's quite clear that especially from, if not before, from the 1950s onwards, there clearly are very different forms of masculinity being created in European society, and the extent to which those masculinities then will impact into my male democratic politics in different ways is something that I probably didn't emphasize sufficiently. There clearly are new forms of masculinity, youth rebellion, gay sexuality. These are forms of public male democratic presence that become quite influential, especially in urban environments in the latter decades of the 20th century. They have emerged for reasons that probably are part of history separate from the one I talked about this evening. So there is a sense that actually these men who I kept going on about this evening are coming from very different places. Isn't it striking how they then actually homogenize within the political sphere in terms of forms of male politics that seem really quite similar and quite conforming to particular templates of what male democratic politics should be, you know, with various movements of rebellion on the fringes, the development of new political movements, the emergence, even comes to my mind, of a new right political culture in Europe in the 1980s. Those are interesting ways in which perhaps new masculinities are creating new forms of male politics. There's more to be done, isn't there?
So I see we have at least one question online as well as one, so I might collect both together if I could. Oh, and one more. So there's 3 questions right now, so I might collect 3, if that's all right with everyone. First, I'll read the one online, and then I'll hand it forward to you. The question from the chat is, thank you very much for the interesting presentation. I would like to have a look on at women, though. How do you fit female political engagement, activism, actions into the picture? Most of the time, female political behavior was as militant, as seriously debating, etc., as the male one, thinking of the British suffragettes, for example. But still, women were denied participating as equal political subjects. So it seems it's not only about behavior and ways of doing politics. How would you explain this? And then perhaps we can, those 2.
Yeah.
You may have answered it a little bit in the previous question, but in your response to the previous question, but it's just a bit of a conceptual one, right? So these ideas of changing male identities, which are expressed through political action and performance, you know, brings us to this idea of masculinity, this word that's come up a bit in the Q&A, but which didn't really come up in the talk. Sub-question, was that a conscious choice? But if we think in terms of masculinity, right, then we sort of run up to this idea that, you know, what it means to be a man is intimately related to how a man performs as a political participant and political actor. And I'm wondering, is your claim actually that strong, or is it more the historically sort of contingent fact that because it was men who dominated democratic politics, we have to understand this specific relationship within politics and not within men, if you see what I mean? Yeah.
So thank you very much for your talk. My question came about watching the pictures right behind you, which confirms a lot about your talk, actually, like the picture that has been on the front page of this whole talk series. And the question is especially about what men do, i.e. education somehow. And the question is, before we talk about men, we need to talk about boys and girls sometimes. How does education feature into the explanatory system that you develop in your upcoming book, so to say, because public schools it isn't a racial sort of battlefield there, but schools are like one of the main claims that are made in the political fields too. So what about schools? What about kids?
3 excellent questions, improvised answers to them. The education one, let's talk about that. Yes, I mean, it's very important, isn't it, the extent to which male identities are constructed especially across the middle and later decades of the 20th century through the progressive extension of years of education into adolescence and into young adulthood and the emergence of the male student, who then gets joined eventually in an interesting change by the presence of large numbers of female students as well. Education could be seen as the way in which the state, one of the ways by which the state or Catholic Church in some countries actually seeks to shape men in particular ways. And I don't want to trivialize that, but I think it's also quite a good example of the forms of rebelliousness and resistance by men against forms of authority that they don't accept. I think many men take away from their education as much of a critique of state power as they do their acceptance of it. And I think that this is without wanting to convey the impression that schools are training schools for democracy, I think they are training schools for a particular form of male assertiveness and male democratic action that are probably really quite influential. And I'm not just talking about universities in the 1960s and 70s. I think there's a much broader way in which education fits into this story. Education that, of course, in much of Europe was single sex. And so these are also male-only environments until the later decades of the 20th century. So there's a real way in which these particular male-only environments, and one could add into that conscription and service in armies as well, are really quite important ways in which men come to internalize a sense of themselves as being a particular sort of rather implicitly privileged citizen. Masculinity, why did I not use the term? Why did I not start from there, in a way, start from the shaping of men in the cultural sphere as being a process, cultural social sphere, as being a particular process that then determines male engagement in public life? Because I think you're right to suggest that I rather deliberately avoided the term, because I don't know that I really accept the interconnectedness that I've just sketched out. It seems to me that masculinity is too often used as a kind of catch-all concept about how men have been shaped in a particular way that then influences, determines even their engagement in political life. It doesn't, for example, allow sufficiently for the extent to which masculinity can then be changed by male engagement in public life, which is, of course, why I wanted to emphasize the men made by politics rather than always wanting to see the politics made by men. The online question about female political engagement is one I entirely accept. It wasn't my subject for this evening, but there is so much good work that's been done over the last 20 or 30 years about the emergence of female political and social citizenship in Europe, in a way that, of course, has gone beyond that sort of pioneer suffragette feminist sort of emphasis, not because that's not worthy of study, but because it's only one way in which women became involved in politics in the 20th century. And so much of female engagement in politics in the 20th century went under the banner of not being political, of not being about politics, of being about other, apparently more important female concerns of family and motherhood and so on. And those forms of rhetoric that we wouldn't accept are nevertheless ones that certainly are very important for female citizenship in the 20th century. And I think there is a whole history that is being written, but still needs to be written more, about the extent to which women become citizens in this process. And the one word I would not use at that point is the word equality, because although that was often a campaigning slogan of female presence in politics, it was something that was not achieved for all the reasons I hope I've demonstrated this evening. The extent to which male dominance or ownership even of the political democratic process was such a dominant fact in Europe, at least until the final decades of the 20th century. These are all excellent questions.
And there's yet another one online, which I think kind of ties into the point you brought up about equality. So I'll read from that. I've learned from Professor Conway's lecture that democracy was a male concept during the 20th century. I would argue that somehow, maybe hidden, it also included the promise of gender equality during the 20th century. Was that just an illusion? Were men aware of this? What did men do to deal with this contradiction?
Along with the other contradictions, perhaps notably of race, that was often present in this democratic politics too. Yes, I mean, there are men who are campaigners for gender equality, unsurprisingly. There are political traditions in Europe, of which Christian democracy, rather perversely, might be seen to be a good example, that actually are about men making a lot of putting a great deal of emphasis on the need for a true democracy to be one that incorporates female agendas. I think it would be an overly liberal reading of this democratic politics to say that a certain agenda of female rights was central to the way in which men conceived of democracy. This rather patronizing recognition of women as citizens did not often stop short of imagining an equality of women, because of that particular male obsession with rejecting the idea of the liberated woman, who remains very much a kind of bogey figure in much male political rhetoric across the 20th century. And I think that sort of demonization of this liberated woman is a very interesting example of the extent to which men take seriously their ownership or their ascendancy within democratic politics. And that makes it, I think, quite difficult for many men from different political traditions of left and right to really embrace a language of gender equality. So for me, although there may be a promise of gender equality, especially by the end of the century, again, I would emphasize how slow it was to come to the fore and really look at the extent to which there was resistance to that language of gender equality.
So I don't see any other questions. I've got one, but I've got a bunch, but I would try to distill them into one that actually sort of continues along the line that Martina Steber brought up about sharpening, sort of sharpening the edge about the question about democracy. Having just read this book on Western Europe's democratic age, one of the theses I think fits in quite well with recent historiography, saying Western Europeans' democratic age wasn't that democratic. And you end in 1968, where you talk about the creation of a more participatory democracy, one in which there are other avenues for political participation of minorities, of women. And you then kind of confirmed that in this speech. And so I'm wondering, you've talked about fascism and communism, the sort of ideologies of the early part was reaching their high point, especially with fascism, the early part of the 20th century, a Western Europe, 1945 to 1968, it's not so democratic maybe as it promised to be. And then a post-1968 period is part of the story also not that the democracies weren't that democratic. Rather than a history of democracy, it could be a history of the failings of something that approaching democracy. And then I guess that really comes back to the question, how does one define democracy?
Well, certainly this idea that democracies are necessarily imperfect, and my rejection of the idea that there is kind of a sort of progressive move towards a progressively more perfect form of, or more inclusive form of democracy. I certainly think that, and therefore my book on the post-war period is inclined to suggest, and I do believe it, that actually this was a very limited and managed model of democracy that came into existence for all sorts of reasons after 1945, and that, for example, some of the political regimes of the 1950s and 60s seem to me to be, in some sense, less democratic than ones that had preceded them. And that's, I think we should accept that there isn't just some sort of forward march of democracy across the 20th century. So they are necessarily imperfect forms of democracy. Do they nevertheless qualify as democracy? Are we therefore right to think that democracy is a stable concept to define the 20th century in Europe? I think on the whole, my answer to that would be yes. Not so much because of the regimes of democracy that came into existence, but because of the democratic identities that come into existence. It seems to me that one of the more interesting features of the post-1945 decades in Europe, West and East, is the extent to which people internalize, men and women, internalize a sense of acting, of having democratic rights. And I think that it's probably, this is a glib answer, but it gets us to the drinks. It's about the extent to which this is the greater success of democracy perhaps lies outside of the political sphere, in the emergence of new cultures of sociability and new forms of mutual recognition that develop not perfectly but imperfectly in Europe across the 20th century, and that I think we might lose sight of if we always focus on the failure of political regimes, which I believe is quite real.
Well, as I see no more questions in the chat or from the audience, all that leaves is for me to step out of the way to get people to the drinks. And again, thank you, Professor Conway, for coming for this interesting talk. And we look forward to continuing to hear your progress with this next project. So thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure.